Welcome to Yahoo Finance Presents. I'm Rick Newman, and joining us today is Jared Bernstein, Chief Economic Advisor to Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate. Jared was Chief Economist to Joe Biden when Joe Biden was Vice President in the Obama administration. Jared Bernstein, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
There's a lot of noise around Joe Biden's plan, a lot of it coming from the Trump administration. I wonder if you could just summarize what Joe Biden's message is on the economy, and then we can get into some of the details.
Well, message one is that there will be no lasting recovery until we get control of the virus. And that's step one. And Biden's not the only one to say this. Fed Chair Jay Powell has said the same thing. The thing about the Biden plan is that he has a true virus control set of ideas, something we've simply not seen from the federal level. And in fact, I think it's a true indictment against the Trump administration, the extent to which they've botched that. His plan guarantees testing and protective equipment for everybody who returns to work. It ensures paid leave for victims of the virus. It creates a 100,000 strong testing and tracing national health care jobs corps, provides support for small businesses and childcare providers who want to reopen. So it's a truly federal organized system to get control of the virus, working in tandem with scientists, governors, mayors, all the way down the line.
Joe Biden has a lot of these plans on his website, which is joebiden.com. I'm not pumping Joe Biden's website. I just always encourage people, go look at the plan for yourself. We can't get into all the details here. But Jared, could you make the connection for people between the types of things Joe Biden says he will do with regard to the virus and how that would get the economy back on track faster before everybody is fully vaccinated? And that could take a few years.
Yeah, it's an important question. As I mentioned, virus control is step one, and there is no step two or three without step one. So he takes that extremely seriously. But the other steps are equally important. The second step is really getting a recovery package that kind of gets us to the other side of the crisis. So Congress came out of the gate with some truly helpful fiscal relief packages. But as we all know, within recent weeks, they've just totally dropped the ball, and at the worst time for so many working families. I mean, that's actually an important characteristic of the current recovery. There are some, and if you're one of these people who's zooming into meetings all day and still drawing a paycheck, you know, this is, you're doing okay. But there's a huge group of people in the bottom half of the income scale who are still really suffering behind this thing, both in terms of health and economics. And so Biden's recovery plan picks up the ball where Congress has dropped it and kind of finishes the construction on this bridge to the other side. And then once we're to the other side, that's where his Building Back Better plan comes in. And this is a plan that creates millions of good paying jobs through clean energy, free tuition for public colleges and universities for families with incomes below $125,000, much more affordable child and health care, onshoring jobs, good manufacturing jobs through government procurement of goods that are made here in America, and de-rigging a set of rules that embed racial bias in our economy.
So, Jared, I mean, that's a lot of ideas. How do you expect Joe Biden to prioritize? I mean, you can't do everything at once, obviously. A lot of what you're describing would take congressional legislation. That depends on the makeup of the Senate and so forth. How would you prioritize these things you're talking about? What's number one?
The sequencing is precisely as I just described. Step one, an effort we have heretofore not seen to truly gain control of the virus. Step two, finish building this recovery bridge to the other side of the crisis. Step three, building back better. That's the campaign phrase, but what it really means is that simply going back to the old normal is far too low a bar. We need to ensure an economy on the other side of this crisis that is far more resilient to the kind of shocks that come fast and furiously these days, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a hurricane that's intensified through global warming, whether it's the kind of racial violence that's been racking our cities. All of these kinds of shocks to our system have been completely ignored and thereby amplified by the current administration. So that's step three, the building back better. And that's the permanent, long-term, really new policy architecture to kind of reconnect so many people who've so long been left behind to a growing economy.
There still is a pretty good chance we will get that fourth stimulus bill passed in the fall. I mean, that, we've got this funding deadline coming up on October 1st. So let's say some form of that stimulus bill does get passed. I mean, it's somewhere between the Democratic and the Republican proposal. You know how that works. You've been in Washington a long time. What is the next thing Joe Biden needs to do in terms of the economy? Is it an infrastructure bill, something like that?
Well, I think that's going to be somewhat time dependent because we have to evaluate the state of the economy if Biden is fortunate enough, I'd say if America is fortunate enough for Biden to become president. He and his new vice president will certainly do real-time evaluation there. Again, getting control of the virus is got to be step one. And Congress hopefully will pass a fourth package. I mean, I don't know what the odds. I used to think the odds were 75-25 on that. I'm coming down quickly because I just see such a lack of urgency, particularly from Senate Republicans. So to me, it's no slam dunk that we're going to be there. But that program in itself is, I think, insufficient to truly controlling the spread of the virus. So that's going to be step one. And then we'll look at the recovery, what's needed there, and also start building the kind of foundation for the kinds of clean energy, tuition, childcare reforms, the Buy American, the procurement plans, the de-rigging the rules regarding racial bias. Those plans are as you can see from looking at what Biden's talking about, those plans are integral to building back better.
Jared, you're an economist, a forecaster. Where do you think the economy is going to be on Election Day? I mean, it's probably not going to change very much from where we are right now, but do you think people will be feeling a little bit better, a little bit worse? Not sure.
Yeah, I'm a little bit worried about that. I mean, the resurgence of the virus, this kind of respiking that we've seen in so many places around the country, has really led to a pulling back of commerce. Lots of the reopening that happened was obviously too soon, and I'm not suggesting that it's been shut down, but about 80% of the population lives in places where commerce is either retrenching or just even going backwards. So I think probably the best way to answer your question, and this is getting into some of the economics you're asking about, is that the output gaps, meaning the gap between where GDP would be at full capacity and where it almost surely will be, or the gap between full employment and where the labor market will be, those gaps are going to be very large. They're going to be many percentage points on the unemployment rate, many percentage points on GDP, and those gaps need to be filled. So I don't think we're going to be out of the recovery business anytime soon. Unfortunately, virtually every forecast suggests it will be years before we get back to full employment. And that's why the Biden sort of 1, 2, 3 agenda here, control the virus, build the recovery bridge to the other side, and then focus on reconnecting people to a growing economy. That sequencing, I think, is the right one.
Trump was pretty effective in 2016 at appealing to white working class voters, especially in the Midwest and the swing states. You can argue that maybe he hasn't served their interests, but his appeal worked, and he's trying to do it again. How does Joe Biden reach those voters who are skeptical of Washington insiders touting a long list of plans? A lot of those people just feel your plans have never helped me in the past. Why should they help me now? What is Biden's way to reach those people?
I think the best way to reach people is to just emphasize the difference between reality and reality TV. Okay. And by that, I mean the following. The Republican Party actually had no platform this year. For the first time in 160 years, they had no policy platform. If you listen to Mike Pence, his policies reduced at one point to depending on miracles. He said, America, America's a land of miracles. And this absence of even a plan to attempt to do something, and instead to try to convince people against their actual lived experience about what's going on. I just think at some point that fails to work, and polling data suggests that it's failing to work already. Now, Biden has a long history of implementing and executing plans of functional governance. Functional governance. So, yes, I'm ticking through a lot of stuff in answers to your questions. I mean, that's inevitable given that we've been doing a ton of planning to meet the depth of the challenges we face. But I guess what I would say in answer to your question is voters need to look at who can actually get these things done, and who, in this case, Trump's approach is just this kind of phony trying to create the impression that he's gotten things done. So if you just look around, and again, last week we had an intense hurricane, which scientists relate to global warming. We are stuck with an unemployment rate about 10%. We have virus cases in around 6 million, 180,000 deaths. We have horrific racial violence. So it's pretty impossible to deny the reality that at least from my perspective, Trump and the Republicans have been so hard trying to do.
So let me ask you about taxes, Jared. This is beginning to get a fair amount of attention. So Joe Biden has a lot of plans to do new things, help students with college costs, a big climate plan, healthcare, and he has some tax increases that he wants to help fund those plans. Now, he has said that he will not raise taxes for anyone earning over $400,000 a year. I did a story on Biden's tax plan recently, and I got a lot of feedback from people saying that's not true. I heard Joe Biden say he will repeal the Trump tax cuts. That means, the small tax cut that I got that was a middle class tax cut, Joe Biden would repeal that. So I know that technically Joe Biden says he will not do that. But my question is about messaging. Are people getting the message about Joe Biden's tax plan when they're thinking to themselves, oh, he's going to repeal that little tax cut I got in 2018?
I think they are starting to get that message. It's an important question. Joe Biden's tax plan does not raise taxes on anyone under $400,000. And that's
in annual income, correct?
Correct. Annual income of $400,000. And that has been something that we worked very hard to craft the tax plan to make sure that we hew very closely and don't allow that promise to be broken at all. And by the way, if you're talking about his increase in capital gains taxes, that doesn't kick in until over $1 million. Now,
$1 million in income, not capital gains, right?
Correct. 1 million in income. So 400,000 in income, nobody below that gets a tax increase. And when it comes to his capital gains increase, nobody over 1 million in income is hit by that. Now, here's the thing. Two fact checkers, PolitiFact and Glenn Kessler from the Washington Post, have now looked at this very carefully, and they both concluded the same thing. What I just told you is true. And I think that's actually very helpful, because I think some of these fact checkers, have a good reputation for looking at precisely these kinds of claims. So any claim to the contrary is false, and that's just not me talking. That's folks whose job is to check these things out.
So you've heard the claim from President Trump and his supporters. Joe Biden is a socialist. Even worse than that, he's a senile socialist. He's a puppet of the extreme left. I mean, I'm being a little sarcastic here, but that's more or less how they say it. My question on this is, our audience at Yahoo Finance, they care a lot about what's going to affect the investing climate. You've advised Joe Biden for a long time. What would you say to somebody who's an open-minded voter, maybe still hasn't made up his or her mind, and is wondering just how socialist is Joe Biden?
It's such a ridiculous claim that I'm just not going to get into it.
It's not my claim.
I'm not saying it's
but it's out there.
The people who are making that claim are being ridiculous, and the attacks on Biden, it's just name calling of a level that I'm just not going to engage in. I think your question about finance is a perfectly good one. And here, I think that you have to evaluate the impact of Trumpian chaos, the impact of Trump's trade war, which I think has been a huge negative for globalization, for farmers, for our manufacturers. That sector was already in recession before the pandemic, and the kinds of, I think, just lurching economic policies that you get from a Trump administration versus the kinds of things we've been talking about over the last few minutes. So I've talked to lots of market participants about this. It's something very important to me because I actually believe that capital markets have a real potential to do what they're supposed to do, which is to channel excess savings and unused capital to its most productive area. That isn't something that capital markets have been doing in recent years, but it is something that I believe they should aspire to. And many people in the markets are telling me that they look forward to a Biden presidency because they just can't take the uncertainty and the constant, governance by ridiculous tweeting and the trade war and the fiscal imbalances that are just coming out of the Trump administration.
Well, Jared, could you maybe just give one example of something in the capital markets you're thinking of, something Joe Biden might reform or improve in some way?
Yeah, I think that the idea that Biden is engaged in domestic investment to not just help, as I've mentioned earlier, create millions of good jobs through clean energy, but really help a clean energy sector get off and running is something that capital markets care a lot about. There are literally trillions of investments in clean and renewable energy. This is no longer some sort of obscure corner of markets. This is something that's really important. And if we can create a set of incentives to help the investment climate in clean energy, we're going to be doing well by doing good. This obviously has critical long-term implications for environmental degradation and economic growth, but it's also helps, I think, in the investment space. So that's one area where he invests $2 trillion in helping to create millions of good quality jobs, but also really trigger some important activities in that sector. I'd say the same thing with a childcare sector. This is maybe less of a markets thing, but there is a missing market when it comes to
working parents care big time.
Exactly, and there's just a big missing market in this country for childcare, and that plan invests almost $800 billion in setting up a childcare and elder care industry where it doesn't exist before. And I think that's a huge plus for America, not just for markets, but for everybody else.
Jared, want to hit one question on energy jobs and then ask about trade. So there is this narrative coming from the Trump administration that Joe Biden wants to eliminate fossil fuels. I'll do the fact checking on that. That is not the Joe Biden plan. But this does become a legitimate concern of some workers, in oil and gas in Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, that Joe Biden might pursue policies hostile to employment in those industries. How does Joe Biden make the transition to some of the climate goals he has without endangering the livelihood of people who work in carbon industries?
Yeah, again, I think you have to look at the plans here, and the plans are very much as you've kind of alluded to and as I've tried to describe them. There are very deep investments in clean energy that, in my view, and the view of the team that really put this plan together, don't exclude any older industries and don't shut anything down. What they do is they take the energy that's already accumulating from the clean energy sector. To say that this sector is off and running is an understatement. It's been so for a long time. And it's not just federal policy. You've got states like California, which obviously have huge economies, that have been setting incentives to get to clean energy within a decade or so. And the Biden plan takes that up to the federal level. So if anything, it hastens the transition out of extractive industries to one that I would argue energy investment is going all by itself, but it helps speed it up.
So let's just finish up with trade here, Jared. If Joe Biden were to become president, he would inherit the Trump tariffs, mostly on imports from China, and then of course China has imposed some measures on U.S. exports, but also tariffs on some aluminum and steel and some other imports from allied nations like Canada. So what would Joe Biden do about those tariffs?
Yeah. So, well, the trade agenda, which the tariffs are are contained in is really a three-part plan. First of all, coalition building with partners who we have no business being adversaries in the trade space. Canada, I think the Canada tariff is based on, threats from Canada to our country, to our geopolitics. Obviously, that's nonsense. So part one is go after the countries like China, who are the real bad players in this space, and do so in coalition with our allies. Part two.
Well, Jared, just let me ask for that, for a caveat on that. Go after them how?
Well, so for example, part two, in the following way, part two is it's time to get exchange rates right. Now, I'm talking to a finance audience here, so they know what I mean. When countries manage their currencies or manipulate their exchange rates in ways to get a price advantage, that leads to distortionary imbalances, which are damaging for countries like our own with large trade imbalances, and some of those of our allies as well. So coalition means we work together. I'm not going to get into precisely the communiques that would be forthcoming from this, because that's way down the road. But coalition actions are something that Joe Biden has a long history of working with. And third, and to me this is key, it is to do the domestic investments and to get the tax policy right, to stop incentivizing offshoring. I mean, the Trump tax plan, I think this has been kind of underreported and underappreciated. The Trump tax plan very seriously incentivized corporations to go offshore. So here's Trump on one hand telling people in the Rust Belt that he's going to save their jobs, and on the other hand, actually passing tax policy that makes it cheaper for factories and multinationals to produce abroad. And in Biden's tax plan, he reverses that incentive. So at the same time as investing in the clean energy sector, procuring American-made goods, the government procures $600 billion in goods every year, and too many of those goods are procured from overseas. So we want to onshore those supply chains. Biden adds another $400 billion to that procurement plan and a Buy America provision. Those three: coalition building, get the exchange rate right, and invest domestically. I think that's a really strong trade agenda.
Just because this has gotten so much attention, it would not make sense for Joe Biden to repeal Trump's tariffs right away. It might make more sense to use them as leverage and repeal them as a part of some kind of negotiated deal. Can you say anything about Biden's approach to the Trump tariffs?
No, because I think that that's an approach that's going to have to be worked out by a set of folks that I am tangential to. So I'm not going to lean into their work. That's one of the things you try not to do, and when you're where I am.
Jared Bernstein, economic advisor to Joe Biden. Thank you so much for the time today.
My pleasure.